Hi, and welcome to the video. I am Jacob Lundy with the Clark-Esposito Law Firm PC here in New York City. So if you follow our firm's video channel, or you read our frequent blog articles on law and trade issues, or if you've done business with us in the past, you likely know that a big component of what we do here is help private companies navigate trade compliance. And this, of course, includes both import and export compliance. But in today's video, I wanted to spend a few minutes doing a basic introduction and explanation of a particular aspect of export compliance known as the deemed export rule. Now, the deemed export rule, in many circumstances, can impose export compliance obligations on U.S.-based businesses who don't actually export anything overseas. So the deemed export rule, its coverage, has really grown in recent years, largely due to the growth in emerging technologies, which are subject to controls. And with that growth, we've seen a real increase in the number of calls to the law firm by companies who are concerned that they have some risk exposure and who just want to understand more about the deemed export rule. So with that increase in questions about the deemed export rule, we thought we would make a short series of videos going into a little bit greater detail over the series about the deemed export rule. Of course, beginning with this video, in which we'll just talk about the basics, what the deemed export rule is and why U.S. businesses, including those who don't actually export anything, should know about the deemed export rule. So with that, I will get started on the basics. And I think the best way to begin is to draw some analogies from actual exporters and talk about the basic framework for export compliance in general, and then move into the deemed export. So let's take a benign consumer item, say a pen. Let's say that I'm a U.S. manufacturer of pens and I ship my pens overseas in export transactions. For a consumer product like a pen, my export compliance obligations are going to be pretty straightforward, kind of a cross your T's and dot your I's sort of thing, nothing too complex. But once we get into high technology and particularly controlled technologies, export compliance obligations will become significantly more involved and more complex. Now, when we say controlled technologies or controlled goods or controlled items, this refers to things that, for a variety of reasons, most often national security, the U.S. government and its various agencies will control. So we can't export, weapons, for example, to just anyone. So there are a couple of frameworks in U.S. law in which exports are controlled, and the most prevalent are one, and you use the example of missiles, military goods, weaponry, and space technology are controlled under ITAR, or the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And then what's going to be most common for civilian U.S. businesses who aren't actually involved in the making of weapons and weapons technology or satellites is the EAR, or the Export Administration Regulations. And these really cover thousands of technologies and items within the United States for export control. What they control is what's referred to as dual-use items. And dual-use, in basic terms, just means something that is, for example, made for consumer markets or for civilian applications, but which has either potential or in some cases obvious military applications. So that's where the dual use terminology comes into play. In today's world, the best example of a dual use item is a drone. It has very clear civilian applications. It has equally clear military applications. And so drones are actually controlled under the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations. So the way these regulations tend to work, and they can be quite complex, if I'm a US-based manufacturer of drones and I want to export my drones to country X, I will have to go through a little bit of a process. And this will include, one, first and foremost, is to figure out under the relevant regulations how my drones are classified. Then, depending on where my drones are going and to whom, so the end user, that could be an individual, a business, or even a foreign government, I'll need to figure out, one, am I just prohibited from conducting this export transaction? Or two, I might actually just need to apply for an export license. So that's really the basics of how controlled technologies and controlled items are regulated for purposes of actual exports. So what then is a deemed export? Well, a deemed export, if you think about these controlled technologies and the national security implications, you can imagine that the US government and its various regulatory agencies who control exports also don't want what I like to call the underlying know-how. So that's the technological know-how, the industrial technique, the manufacturing technique, a software. They also don't want those underlying items to fall into the wrong hands, so they control them just the same way as they would the physical item itself. And one of the ways they control this know-how is through the deemed export rules. Both ITAR and the EAR have a deemed export rule written into them. So the basics of a deemed export rule are as follows. If I'm a US-based manufacturer of some controlled technology, or I'm involved in research or development of a controlled technology or item, whether it's a weapon system or a dual-use system, if I'm going to transfer these intangible components, know-how, technology, software, to a foreign person, and that's the word the regulations in both cases use, who is in the United States, I'm going to have very similar, and in most cases, the same export compliance obligations as if I were sending those items overseas. So there are some caveats to the definition of a foreign person, but essentially, if you're a company in the US and you're operating in some controlled space, before you, number one, release or even grant some sort of access to the underlying know-how or software or technology, you're going to want to know how your items are controlled and whether or not you need an actual export license to make that release or transfer or access to a foreign person, even within the United States, before you do so. Most frequently, this comes up in the context of an employment relationship or a subcontractor relationship. So imagine these companies operating these startups in the biotechnology sector, which are controlled. They hire a lot of foreign scientists. And if their underlying technologies and softwares and know-how are controlled, they're going to need to understand their export compliance obligations when, say, hiring a foreign person scientist who will have access to these technologies or this know-how. But this can also, and this is very important, there's the subcontractor or the employment relationship, but remember, there's no caveats within the regulations to what constitutes a release or access in terms of how involved it is. It can be a visitor to your facility. It could be someone on a factory tour. How much access do they have? Is there an actual transfer of some of this information? Are they left alone with it and things like that? So, we always recommend you should never play guessing games with what your obligations are. If you understand as a business, or if you don't understand, but you need to understand whether or not your sector, what you do as a business, whether it's research, development, or manufacture of controlled items or controlled technology, you need to understand how or if they're classified under any regulations, which include the International Traffic in Arms Regulations or the EAR. Then you need to consider, when you have foreign persons who are going to have virtually any type of access or who will be subject to any release of these technologies or know-how or technological methods, you need to understand whether or not there are licensing obligations that go along with that. So going back to the example of me as, say, an American drone manufacturer, if I want to hire a foreign scientist to come and help me with my development or with the manufacturing, I know that my technology is controlled. So now I need to go the extra steps to find out how it's classified and where my scientist, where his nationality is he subject to a license requirement for me to be able to release this know-how to this scientist. So those are the basics, the very basics of the deemed export rules and how they work. Now, you can put yourself in the shoes of someone who might be operating in one of these controlled sectors. If that rings a bell, then that should trigger the next steps. You really are going to want to understand how your underlying technologies or goods are classified, or if they're classified. And then if they are, you really need to sort of have an export compliance program in place, even if you don't conduct any exports, as I said, because of the deemed export rule. So this is certainly something we can help with, even if it's just understanding whether or not this applies to your business or you. So with that, I'll end this video and hopefully see you again in the next video, where we'll get into some of the more common emerging technologies that are becoming controlled under these regulatory regimes. and the really exponential growth in the types and numbers of technologies that are being controlled. Things, again, like AI, 3D printing, and advanced manufacturing applications, biotech, and rocketry, drones, things like that. So we'll get into that in the next video. In the meantime, if you're a viewer and you think that you might be covered by some of these regulations, the deemed export rule based on the sectors you operate in, or if you know that you are and you have questions about your obligations under the deemed export rule, whether or not you export, feel free to give us a call at 917-546-6997. We would be happy to discuss the basics with you. And we, of course, have a consultation process for people who do have some compliance obligations and want to get ahead with developing a program and to stay out of trouble with these regulatory agencies. So thank you again, and we hope to see you again shortly in the next video.
Subscribe and click the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when we upload a new video. Check out our playlist if you want to see more of our videos, and comment below and introduce yourself. We'll see you soon.